Hi, I'm Simon Ligo. I'm an evolutionary ecologist at the University of New Orleans.
Hi, I'm Jerry Husak. I'm an evolutionary physiologist at the University of St. Thomas.
Welcome to Biology Exit Interviews, where we sit down with biologists who've had long and distinguished careers to talk about their science and about how biology has changed over the course of their working lives.
And whether you're brand new to integrative biology or you've been doing it for decades, I hope you'll join us and find something interesting in our stories. Thanks for joining us.
All right, welcome to Biology Exit Interviews. Today we are sitting down with Henry John-Alder. He is a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers University. Henry has tons of publications. He's worked with a ton of different species over the course of his very distinguished career. Some of Henry's works have been really influential to me over the years, and I'm sure for a lot of people as well. Um, so welcome, Henry. Thanks. Thank you very
Thanks very
much
much.
for being with us. So just to restate the premise of what we're doing, this is inspired by a meeting that Jerry and I had with David Wake many years ago, where he told us that, before he'd finished his PhD, he had a job offer. Before he took up his job, he had an NSF grant. That's not how anything works anymore. Um, Part of doing this is to get down on the record the experiences of people who've gone before us. So why don't we start off by talking a little bit about your pathway into science and academia?
Well, my pathway was a little bit circuitous initially. I I, um, I was a biology major in college, and I was really happy with that. My dad was a biologist, and I had grown up being taken out to collect frogs instead of going to baseball games and that sort of thing. So, uh, had been a bird watcher since sixth grade and such. So I kind of was just in a track that I felt comfortable with. But in college, I was in a small college where many of the biology students went on to medical school, and I hadn't really thought about next steps. And I thought, oh, I guess I'm going to go on to medical school. But I didn't apply right away. Instead, I got a job. I was lucky. I got a great job as a research assistant, a lab tech, basically, in the Department of Physiology at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. And I was able to work in that job for 2 years. And it gave me a great opportunity to develop some technical skills and to be exposed to professional science as it was done. And I didn't get into medical school, as it turns out. I did apply kind of half-heartedly at the interview where they had all of the applicants coming in for the interview at one of the medical schools. We were sitting in an auditorium, and the host asked, "How many of you want to go to medical school?" And all these excited hands shot up. Not mine. I guess I realized I wasn't really. I was just kind of lukewarm about it. I went on to a master's program at Penn State, which was pretty much a biomedical physiology program. I learned a lot of physiology and some laboratory methodologies and such, but I wasn't really thrilled about that either. And luckily, I had a professor who told me about opportunities for comparative and ecological physiology at UC Irvine. I applied to several places and ultimately went to UC Irvine and got into Al Bennett's lab and just sort of said, I'm a blank canvas. Al, get me started here, and things worked out pretty well from there. The people at Penn State thought that it was a big mistake to go into comparative or ecological physiology. They counseled me to get my degree in biomedical physiology, and if I wanted to do comparative work afterwards, after I got a job, fine, but that I would be greatly limiting opportunities if I were to switch at that point. But it didn't work out that way. The experience at the University of Pennsylvania was interesting because at that time, people had handheld calculators, but nobody had a laptop computer. And I worked for one of my bosses was a biochemist uh, from Japan, a Japanese man, and he did all of his calculations on a slide rule. This was in 1974, 75. The department was staffed with scientists and technicians and such, obviously, but it was still at a time where there was a machinist, there was an in-house electrician, and I think a lot of places will have still a machine shop and perhaps an electrician to support science labs. But there was also a glass blower. Every major research institution had glass blowers because people would build their own equipment and design their own equipment. So that was pretty fun. But I transferred. I took my master's degree at Penn State and then moved out to California and got into Al Bennett's lab at a good time, and it just opened a world of taking physiology in directions I had never really thought about. The first work I did was looking at the thermal at the effects of temperature on running endurance of desert iguana lizards. So I had a lizard and a heater and a treadmill and an oxygen analyzer, and uh, that turned out to be a pretty good project. Got into some pretty wicked arguments with Al Bennett over some issues, but that was all part of the development process, I guess.
What was Al like as an advisor?
He was well, to me, he was great. He was great. He was a really good instructor because if you were in the lab to learn a new technique, how to use a spectrophotometer or how to use any kind of equipment, he would begin at the beginning and describe how to use the instrument all the way through to where you felt like you could work with it. And what was good about that is that you might already have known part of what he was going to say initially, but at some point he'd pick you up where if you get onto a place where you were learning new things from him. So he would always start. He wouldn't presume any prior knowledge, and in a completely non-insulting way, he would start at the beginning and take you through. And but he was pretty demanding. A lot of the students were a little nervous about working under his direction. It was good for me though, and he had good people in the lab. Rich Marsh and Todd Gleason and Ted Garland was one of my lab mates who came in a year after me. Brett Adams came in a few years later. Uh, it was good. A lot of opportunity to do interesting science, but also to travel a little bit. I mean, the first travel I did was to go to Eagle Lake with Al and Steve Arnold to do some work on garter snakes. But the next travel I did was after completing my PhD. I went with Al for a year to do postdoctoral work in Australia, and of course, that was, as you can imagine, a great experience. And that was I got to meet all of the leading people in the field, whether they had whether they were coming through Irvine to give lectures or uh, going to meetings. Al would introduce me to all of the people. I remember meeting. But I never met Knut Schmidt-Nielsen, but I met Bodil Schmidt-Nielsen, and I just was so nervous about talking to her when I was introduced to her.
Are there so apart from Al and that intellectual environment that you must have had in that lab, that sounds fantastic. Are there any other people who are particularly influential to you early on?
I mean, I would say that some of the other faculty members at Irvine were quite influential. Ted Garland and Todd Gleason were both quite influential. They were, fellows. I think Todd might have just completed his PhD by the time I got started, and Ted had came in after I did. They were influential. I mean, I met everybody you can think of who is important in the field. I met and developed some level of relationship with, and so they were all influential. I don't know if you want me to mention names, but they were all influential in some way or another.
It's interesting. So you that when earlier on before that time, you said that you were kind of discouraged from doing comparative physiology work, and then there you were thrust into this, what would become a who's who of, ectotherm physiology. Would you, I mean, I guess, would you say it was unique kind of in that environment, or as you started to meet other people elsewhere, did you find it was more common than you thought it was, or was it really kind of isolating in the bigger field?
Well, the people that I met, the practitioners of comparative and ecological physiology who I met, were doing really serious physiology. It just happened to not be on common laboratory models for biomedical research. Whether it was insect physiology, Bob Josephson was one of the faculty members, and he was an insect physiologist, a muscle physiologist. He was as good as anybody could have been with muscle physiology, maybe better. Um, Kim Bradley was an osmoregulatory physiologist working with insects, and his depth of knowledge was just really impressive. So I guess learning that working on sort of non-standard or non-conventional model organisms wasn't necessarily taking a cop out or a bad thing or an easy way out. And it's funny because when I went to Australia, I had a 1 year appointment. I knew it was 1 year, and I felt it was. I was married at the time, and I still am, by the way. But I was married, and I felt some urgency to know where I was going to land by the time my year in Australia was up. I wanted to have a job to come back to, and then I ended up lining up a postdoctoral position in the Upstate Medical Center, part of the State University of New York system in Syracuse, New York. And it was a great lab, a really leading exercise physiologist doing basic muscle metabolism in an exercise context. And but during that year, I was applying for jobs, and that's the year I got the job. That was 1985. I guess 1984, 85. I got the job at Rutgers, and it occurred to me that if I hadn't gotten a job that year, so I went into that postdoctoral position thinking, well, it's physiology. It's just that they're doing physiology in an exercise biomedical kind of context, and I want to do physiology more of an ecological evolutionary context. But it's a different mindset, and I think if I hadn't gotten a job that year, I probably would have had to commit to maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years of postdoctoral work in a biomedical setting to make myself competitive thinking that way. So I think that was an interesting sort of change in perspective that I went through at that time.
It's interesting that you mentioned that people back in the day were doing this serious physiology, and it's something that I personally think about a lot as sort of the mechanistic perspective and connecting mechanisms to fitness. Have you seen any changes in how people do that? Do you think we're better at connecting mechanisms to fitness now, or do you think it's still very siloed?
Well, I think that a lot of the connection has gone to lower level to a molecular level, uh, and some of the functional connections are kind of not being investigated as intensively as maybe they had been earlier on before the molecular wave really took hold. I may be wrong. Maybe that's just my perspective, but I feel like there was a great in this Society for Integrative Comparative Biology, which was ASC at the time. I think there was a greater depth of really serious physiologists doing serious comparative physiology at the time. But maybe that's not right. Maybe that's just my perspective. But having gone through the early training at UPenn, then grad school, but then another year of postdoctoral work in Syracuse, I feel like it really gave me a broad and pretty deep understanding and perspective of the field. And I've always felt that I had that greater breadth of appreciation of the field than a lot of colleagues. In fact, one of the things I remember Al Bennett telling me, I don't know if this was when I was applying for jobs or just at some point during grad school, but for an organismal biologist, an organismal biologist sits in the middle of the organization of biology from molecular right on up through ecosystems and such. And so in a broad-based biology department, that person is really well suited to become in a leadership role because they have a better understanding in all directions of the kind of work that their colleagues are doing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you mentioned what would become SICB, as well as the kind of the community at Irvine that you had when you were in grad school. But kind of thinking about SICB, which you've been a big part of for a number of years, and it's how we met at some point in the past.
Hmm.
Um, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that kind of broader community of integrative biologists. When you were first getting started, kind of what those interactions were like, what the people were like, and then have you seen that change at all up until now? Because you're still really active, and I mean, what kind of changes have you seen over the years, just in how the community operates at whatever level you want to think about it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I went to ASE and then SICB, and it was kind of starstruck because all of the established scientists were just rock stars. I don't know if things have fundamentally changed other than where your position is in that hierarchy. I'm not saying that I've become one of those rock stars, but I've become more senior, obviously. I've had students from other places who have approached me and said, "Hey, I read your paper about this or that," and they feel like it's some kind of privilege or something to be able to meet me. So I'm on the other side of things, and it's kind of fun. I guess one of the things that has changed a little bit maybe is that I think the way that we treat contributions to projects in terms of who gets to be an author versus who gets to get an acknowledgement. I think that we've gone toward a place where almost everybody who contributes ends up becoming an author if it's any kind of meaningful contribution at all. Whereas I think when I started, to be acknowledged by a group of senior authors was a pretty important thing. I was disappointed not to be an author on a project I worked on when I was a research technician at UPenn, but the chair of the department, who was ultimately my boss, explained to me at the time that the significance of being acknowledged and so on and so forth in a convincing way, and so I was satisfied.
What do you think led to that change? That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that. What do you think was what things could have factored into that? An actual realization that, yes, these are in fact significant contributions and we should acknowledge them. Or is it more of a,
Well, I don't know. I think I don't know. I guess I feel like the criteria for or the threshold of contribution to become an author have somehow kind of gradually been relaxed. I don't think in any, maybe not in any conscious way, but I just feel like it's somewhat. I was absolutely stunned. One year I was in Paris working with John Claubert and some of his colleagues, and while I was there, I reviewed one of the papers that they were writing and helped put it into sort of more everyday English for them. And they thought that contribution was important enough to include me in the list of authors afterwards. And I didn't decline. Maybe I should have, but I thought that I'm not sure if I'm convinced that was enough to become an author on a paper. But maybe that's part of the problem. People have that opportunity to become an author in a world where showing your deans and such that you've got a lot of publications is so important. Maybe that's just too tempting to take the chance when you get it.
So that is exactly what I was about to ask you. Is I remember being very surprised several years ago to get an email from a colleague that I was writing a paper with saying, "Can I be the corresponding author because my institution has decided that that is a meaningful metric in some way?" And yeah, I wonder how much that really is driven by the sort of bean counting approach of a lot of deans and institutions and administrators.
Yeah, there was since I've been at Rutgers, I came to Rutgers in a big department of biological sciences, and at some point, sort of mid career, there was a enormous reorganization of biological kinds of departments, and I ended up for a few years in the Department of Animal Sciences, which at the time I described it to myself as collegial to a fault. Everybody was on everybody else's papers, so when the department asked people to list it on their CV, count up on their CVs, their papers, they would all be double and triple and quadruple counting the same papers, but it looked like the department was hugely productive.
Well, I mean, they want us to play games. We may as well play the game smarter, I suppose.
I guess so. Yeah. But yeah, I had given some thought to what kinds of things have changed over the span of my career, and I think that's one of the way. I mean, sometimes you see articles in Science, for example, where there are 50 authors or some crazy thing like that, and it's just unimaginable that 50 people could have made such a meaningful intellectual contribution. I mean, I have no doubt that they made important contributions, whether it's by collecting in unusual places or whatever it might be. But 50 authors, how can 50 people make any meaningful contributions to one paper?
It does seem like the incentive structures to science have changed in a fairly dramatic way. Certainly, at least over the course of my career, which is not particularly long. Do you see any evidence of that?
I think that it's certainly intensified. Uh, I think that the junior faculty feel a tremendous responsibility publish as often as they can, and the promotion criteria of universities like Rutgers, and I'm sure many others, is strongly tilted toward research productivity, where productivity means publications, but also grants. When I started, I was advised that if you had 2 papers or so per year, that you'd be on a good track. Now you see people that are applying for jobs that already have 15 publications and or sometimes more, and people put together big labs, and all of their students are writing stuff, so that when they end up with a dozen or more papers in a year. um, it seems kind of astounding. I think it's just intensified, and I think part of that is probably that. Yeah, another thing that has changed at Rutgers. Um, so I started in 1985. About 10 years after I started, the state support of Rutgers started to fall off pretty dramatically, and the proportion of the university budget that comes from student tuition went up, and the proportion coming from state and federal or state anyway, state funding would come down. And so the universities, the Rutgers, and I'm sure every other state university has pushed grantsmanship and getting external funding for the indirect costs that come along with that. I think that's and that when there was the reorganization here at Rutgers, I went from the School of Arts and Sciences into the what was at that time a School of Agriculture and Environment. And it was just at the end of a period where virtually everybody doing any sort of agricultural related work had a federally funded technician, a state or federally funded technician. But that's almost entirely gone by the wayside now with decreases in funding. So my career was really beginning at a time where uh, so it was 30 years after, or 20 years, I guess, or so after Sputnik, but it was an enormous growth period for the scientific infrastructure of the United States. Um, I think now we're at a time where there's a contraction and a reevaluation, and there'll be another growth period. It might be in a different direction, and it might be sometime later, but right now it's a period of quite a lot of financial stress within universities, within the scientific community. As you were saying, that somebody that you talked to whose career began well before mine had a job and a grant before they even began. I can't remember if I got my first NSF grant, but if it wasn't my first, it was my second, and I just wasn't worried about it. I knew it was going to happen. Um, it was a time where there was still pretty good support for science. So
Yeah, and I think having it all be at the whims of people who are outside of science can make that challenging. So that, people who are entering academia now as professors are, a slightly different scenario with what they can expect to rely on for the first part of their career. It's challenging for sure.
we interviewed a person I think it was 2 years ago or a year ago. It must have just been last year. And we ended up hiring her because we think she's great. But she prepared her seminar in part based on a proposal that she was preparing to submit that had something to do with climate change. And it was, that very day or certainly within a day or two before her seminar, when we all learned that if you had climate change in your NSF grant, that you were dead duck. So there she was, kind of shell shocked, trying to give her seminar. But another thing that was happening early in my career, this was when I was in graduate school, although I think the volume maybe came out a year or so after, but there was a really a period of introspection within the fields of ecological and comparative physiology. I mean, there had been a long history going back to August Kroger before of comparative physiology making a lot of really interesting and important contributions on how animals succeed and thrive and survive in the face of environmental challenges and such. It was in the 1980s that some of the real architects of the field began to think about sort of a broader unifying structure, an evolutionary structure. And one of the publications that was really a significant publication in the mid 1980s was called New Directions in Ecological Physiology, where really the bringing phylogenetic approaches into ecological physiological analyses became important, and the idea of a field of evolutionary physiology really started to come into play at that time. So there was a really and it ended up leading to a really productive period of time following this kind of this new way of thinking about the field that had some organizing structure to it. Physiology providing mechanisms for evolution to work on, or physiology constraining what evolutionary outcomes might be possible, and that kind of thing. So that was an exciting period.
Yeah, that's a great classic paper. Do you feel like everything from that kind of came to be realized, or are we still working away at kind of where those suggestions were pointing us to?
Well, I think that I think that to a, I think that some things have been realized, but I mean, the phylogenetic approach is sort of an accepted way of doing things. The two species comparison has gone the wayside if you want to draw robust conclusions. The molecular technology that has come on in the last 20 years or so and has led to enormous changes. Technical advances have led to directions that hadn't, previously nobody could have conceived of, I think, in some ways. I think what we need to maybe go back a little bit and fill in some of the gaps between changes in expression or changes in gene expression and what might happen with the products of gene expression in terms of the functional biology of organisms. But so yeah, I think there's some unrealized promise yet. I don't think that well's dry there.
One of the things that that we talk about a lot with some of our colleagues is how graduate students don't seem to read the literature in as much detail as they used to. And I'm thinking about what you said earlier about people being serious physiologists. I'm certainly reading some of your early papers. They are proper physiology. I don't know. Do you feel like the field as a whole is doing a good job of preparing people to do proper integrative biology? Because it seems to me like sometimes people just do a little bit from here, a little bit from there without really mastering anything. And I'm not sure if that's a good base for it. What do you think?
Well, I think you're right, and I think you're right to some extent, and I think in part we're victims of our own technology. It used to be that if you needed to find a paper, you'd go to the library and get a hardbound volume off the shelf and page through it until you got your paper. And inevitably, looking through the table of contents or just flipping through the pages, you'd find 3 or 4 other papers that, wow, that looks interesting. I think I'm going to read that one too. And and then we went to mostly online library journals. And even then you'd usually have to find the particular issue that you were looking for, and maybe there would be 20 papers, and you'd go down through the table of contents and see some other papers that you'd want to read that you hadn't been aware of. But at this point, you can just pinpoint your search for the exact paper you want, and so you come up with this thing, and there's none of that sort of browsing context. You don't know what else was done there. I think that and I think that this probably isn't universally true, but it used to be really important to me to not just read the paper, but to look through the authors and sort of go backwards from that paper to things that had preceded. And I think maybe that's an art form that we need to return to a little bit better than we're doing right now. It's hard. I maybe I shouldn't generalize, because I'm sure there are some students who are. We've got some really great students here, and some of them I think are really knowledgeable in their fields. But if you, I mean, I think if you don't know where you've been, it's hard to know where you're trying to go. And so to have the history, to have the prior knowledge of where you're going. I mean, I still use a paper that was published in 1920 to demonstrate basic thermal effects on locomotor patterns. There was a paper by Harlow Shapley that was published in 1920 on ants that can walk from temperatures from over at like a 50-degree Fahrenheit, almost a 50-degree centigrade span of temperatures. And not only does it show the basic idea of a thermal performance curve, to see an organism that can function over such a broad range of temperatures is trying to impress my students. That's astounding. Think of yourself. If your temperature changed 5 degrees, you'd be feeling really bad if you were even alive.
Well, also with as students are coming up now, there's just more literature too, it seems like. More journals, and each of those get more shorter articles, and so it's like, even if you wanted to catch up and keep up, it's just a different beast, I think, than it was even 20 years ago.
What is the least publishable unit, I think, is maybe become kind of more prevalent than it would have been. Well, even before the beginning of my career, I think, the way that papers were written in the 1950s or the 1940s or earlier was a different way of writing stuff.
Yeah.
More comprehensive, I would say, maybe in some ways.
I think you're exactly right about that experience. So I've actually had this conversation with graduate students where I had to explain to them how people found papers back in the day. Like, you'd actually have to go to the library, you'd have to browse the stacks. And when I was an early graduate student, I just moved to the United States and I didn't have any friends. So I would just browse the journals for fun. And today I still don't have any friends, but I don't do that anymore. So how do you keep up with the literature these days? Because the papers that I mostly read are papers that I review. And then if I need to write a manuscript, I have to read some papers. So what's your strategy?
Well, I've gotten kind of lazy as I've gotten closer to the exit. But I like to browse through some of the big journals, the big broad journals like Science. I'll browse through journals that I'm familiar with and have been familiar with. If I see new publications from people that I've worked with or people that I follow or have stayed in touch with, then I'll follow up on those a little bit. But I don't systematically comb through journals the way I did at one point in my earlier career. I've kind of gotten away from that, I have to admit.
It's tough. I get table of contents alerts for lots of journals and promptly see them scroll down off my inbox, and then they no longer exist. It's so much.
And another thing that's happened, and I'm sure that you get the same things. I mean, there's not a day that goes by where I don't get invited to submit to a special journal on the endocrinology of diabetes because of my expertise on such and so and so forth. Because all of these vanity journals that are trying to drum up business around the world, they don't discriminate. I don't know. They must find a keyword somewhere or other that triggers that invitation. But it's crazy.
So we've talked a lot about how kind of the field has changed, and academia in general has kind of changed over the course of your career. But what about you? So how have your academic priorities changed over the course of your career from those early days until where you are now? I know you were chair of your department for 12 years, for example, but have priorities changed for you?
Well, they have. I mean, earlier on and for probably most of my career, I was really excited about what was going on in my lab and working with my students and postdoc if I had them at the time. And I like to be doing stuff. I've never been as good a writer as I should have been. I think there are probably a number of things I've left on the table, but I really just got enthusiastic always about working with students and going out in the field with them or doing stuff in the lab with them. And I got the opportunity to be the department chair, and most, there's not there's never a long line of people waiting outside the door to become department chair. So, but I'm one of the people that I kind of enjoyed the job because I liked being able to do things for the department, for the faculty. I liked the recognition that I would get from higher level administrators and such. But now I think I've gotten to a point where I feel like that the biggest, certainly I feel like the biggest shared responsibility that we as a faculty have is train the next generations of people that are coming through in the undergraduate classes, and it's hard because I feel like coming in less and less well prepared, and as a faculty we're leaving a lot to chance. We don't allow, or whether we don't or the administration doesn't allow faculty to really commit the time and energy that's required to try to bring the undergraduates along. They give us large classes, which makes it really hard. And I've gotten to a point where I feel like having moved from chalkboard to PowerPoints, ultimately, I'm not sure if that was a good thing because it's so easy to put too much stuff into a lecture, and you end up losing students behind as you go through it all. So I think, yeah, I think at this point I feel like a lot of higher education and part of it's related to the way that funding sources have changed. State funding has been reduced, but I think a lot of times universities are basically taking as much tuition as they can from undergraduates, admitting as many as they can, and charging as much, and returning only as, a bare minimum as they feel like they can get away with, to give the kids a chance to become educated, and not just kind of grabbing them by the throat and say, we're going to make sure you get educated. So I feel like we're not fulfilling that collective responsibility. The individual, you know, that's leading their lab and research groups is what always gets the priority. I mean, there's no doubt that the contributions that universities make collectively to the research endeavor, to advancements that are for the betterment of humanity or other things, there's no doubt about their importance. But that collective responsibility of preparing the next generations to lead, I think that we could put more into that.
So if you've been in university in one form or another for decades at this point. So how has the experience of being a researcher and a teacher at university changed over that time? Because my personal opinion is that very little of the administration does actually helps us do our jobs properly. Do you feel that same type of interference, and if so, is it different from when you started out?
Well, I think that I feel like there's been a tendency for the administrative structure to grow, and I think part of that is that when people get into administrative positions, they get this feeling that if they can just get somebody to organize this a little bit better, things will go better, or we'll get this a little bit more organized when things will go better, and that's never right, or it's not usually right. But I think that the most important thing is to provide the resources and the freedom for faculty members to be able to run with what they can do and what they know, and try not to be for the administration to try to look at how they can make connections across campus or form this group or that group. Or I don't know that those things are often very productive. I think that collaborations on campus happen when people feel like there's a connection that needs to be made or wants to be made, and they'll do it. But so yeah, I think there was a time when I was chair where I was in a little bit of a disagreement with my dean about some of the funding that had been promised to the department, and so I contacted a close friend of mine who was a dean at another university, and his first comment back to me was, "Well, they might start by reducing the number of deans they have over there," and I don't know, but that's sort of sour grapes, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. One other common problem in academia, it just in general, and it's probably always been there, is just preparing new faculty for what all is going to come when they start that job. So, in graduate school and postdoc years, you're trained to do mostly the research. Maybe you'll do a little bit of teaching, but everything else is just a mystery. And then you get thrust into a new position, excited, and then, in come the committee assignments and all the meetings that go with those things and being an accountant and an HR manager, etc. Do you feel like that's gotten better? So with administrative growth, do you feel like there's been that at least benefit that they help people more, or is it still just meh?
I don't know. I mean, I almost feel like it almost comes down to who's in those positions as opposed to what those positions are. Our current dean recently formed a new position, an associate dean for faculty development and campus culture or something. Like, I can't remember exactly what it was, but my first thought was that sounds like the director of the summer camp I went to when I was in eighth grade.
It's different because that person's going to make $300,000.
So I think that there's some pretty unnecessary positions. But right
They,
now, our dean has given a tremendous amount of power to the chief financial officer, who's not an academician at all, never has been. And I think a lot of us feel like that's a really big mistake. She's given him a lot of authority to make important decisions on startup packages, on lines to be funded, on staffing, meeting the staffing needs of departments, and it's not going over real well.
I know we're getting a little short on time here, and I want to be mindful of that. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about some of your Scoloporous work, because the work that you've done with sexual size dimorphism and the mechanisms leading to that has always just been really influential to me. But I'm kind of curious to hear more about the story around that. So, of course, if you look at different Scoloporous lizard species, they can differ in their kind of direction of sexual size dimorphism. In some males bigger, some it's the opposite. Some there's monomorphism. But specifically your testosterone work showing how growth is affected in opposite ways in different species at surface level seems totally counterintuitive and surprising. But I guess I'm curious to kind of hear, like, how did you start getting into that? What led you to looking for that possibility? And then did you get pushback for that or any kind of resistance to that?
Well, first of all, let's give credit where credit's due. Bob Cox came into my lab shortly after we had started to move in that direction, and a lot of the success that we had can be attributed to that. And of course, he's gone on to become a pretty distinguished scientist in his own right, and he's taken in directions I never would have. So the first time it occurred to me that testosterone might have something to do with some of the things we were interested in is I was actually working with thyroid hormones at the time, and we had done a project to look at how the exercise capacities of male lizards might be associated with their ability to patrol home ranges and have opportunities for mating. And doing some experiments with captive lizards, for some reason we had a shortage of aquaria, so we had all mature male Scoloporus in the laboratory at the time, and we had them housed 10 each in large cattle tanks, so they weren't too crowded, but I mean, it's still pretty crowded, as opposed to being in their individual aquaria or terraria. And within each of these groups of 10, it became apparent that there were one or two that had really vivid coloration, and their blue colors of their bellies was much more vivid than some of the others, and their dorsal coloration was a more of a sort of a yellowish red than some of the darker ones. And it turns out that their testosterone levels were higher, and their reproductive tracts had been stimulated, and so on. So, and meanwhile, male lizards that had been housed together, they all looked the same. So they didn't have these social interactions. They didn't have that stimulus. So I guess Bob was in the lab at the time, and we started to get interested in the idea that the testosterone was an important growth regulator, and we did a big comparative analysis of the literature on sexual size dimorphism in lizards to find out what's the evidence of what are the current thoughts of how some species have evolved to be male larger, and other species female larger. But Bob was doing his field research in California, in the Chiricahuas of Arizona, where he was doing experimental work in the field with Scolopus virgatus. Oh, I know. So at that point, a number of other people had done experiments looking at the effect of testosterone on lizards, and in all cases, I think they had found that testosterone caused lizards to grow less quickly. But we did our experiments by putting little silastic implants into lizards in the field, and that seemed to make all the difference, because we promoted growth in Scolopus undulatus and eastern fence lizards. And then Bob went to the Chiricahuas and did an analysis of Scolopus eurovii and Scolopus virgatus, which have opposite patterns of size dimorphism. And he found that the testosterone promoted growth in Scolopus eurovii. I think that was the first time that anybody had reported in a lizard that testosterone could promote growth. So that really launched us. And that became the basis of most of his dissertation work. And he took it on in directions to look at how testosterone might affect growth regulatory genes and different patterns. And we recently, meaning I guess the grant ended a few years ago, but with Bob Cox and Christian Cox, who was a former postdoc with Bob and me, we had a big collaborative grant that was a broad comparative analysis of multiple species of Scolopus, but also some other closely related lizards. Chris Robinson was part of that project, and others. So at this point, I've kind of stepped back from it because I'm really pretty close to calling at the end of the day. But Bob's really taken that off. He's really taken it off in evolutionary and genetic ways that I never would have imagined. So I guess I feel like that was a project that we began sort of at a high point in my career, but it's led to just ever more growth, and so I feel like I had a part in the early stages of that, and it's been a good thing.
And launched a few more careers along the way, which is
launched a few
great.
more careers along the way. Yeah.
So when you mentioned that you're considering retirement, and there seems to be like two paths that people take when they retire from academia. Either they sort of, stay as an emeritus and are still involved, or they just, play golf and work in a bicycle shop. So what are you thinking post-retirement?
I think that when I retire, I'll retire. I'll step away from Rutgers, and I'll step away from my scientific career. At this point, I have a few papers that I would like to write before I retire, and I hope I do that. If I don't get that done before I retire, because there are other things, I'll hopefully finish them up in the first year or two of retirement. I think I'll step away. We recently purchased a place up in the Adirondack Park that we enjoy, and we feel like it's a base where we'll get an opportunity to see my son and his family, and our grandson, most importantly. I've got some things going on. I've kind of discovered carpentry, not in any very sophisticated way, but in ways that I get a lot of satisfaction out of. And so it's kind of gotten to a point where it used to be that my life, outside of Rutgers got in the way of everything that was my priority. But now I can feel that it's kind of gone the other way. My priority, the things I have to do at Rutgers are kind of getting in the way of the life that I want to pursue in retirement. So it'll be another year or two probably, and then I think I'll step away. But I won't be one of those people who lives close by, needs to have an office on campus, comes in and probably won't come up to seminars. And I think I'll just step away.
Yeah, that sounds lovely. I sounds
It's
nice.
not everybody. I mean, people we know, we all know Ray, for example, and he's gone as strong or stronger now than he ever did in his career. But and there are some like that, but there are others like my advisor who he stepped away from his career. He's got a lot going on in his life, but he stepped away from his main career. Another friend of mine retired from his position at one university, but now he goes frequently and works with a close collaborator of his at another nearby university. So he's I don't know, he must be pretty close to 80, I think. So
Yeah, I have a few colleagues who have retired and then gone back to be adjunct and teach afterwards, and it just seems like an interesting way to spend your time afterwards.
well, that's actually something that's occurred to me. I might consider doing that. Rutgers has a rule that you have to be separated from the university for, I think it's 6 months. It's 6 months or 12 months before you could even consider doing that. And that has to do with the way that the retirement system is set up, I think. But yeah, that sounds like it could be appealing. I enjoy interacting with the students in my undergraduate classes. Not all of them, I mean, but a few, enough of them that I can imagine possibly doing that kind of thing.
Lots of options, I suppose. Lots of time to figure it out. Well,
Yeah.
thanks again for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.